Hello, everyone. This is Alice Pistono. I am the Director of Brand and PR here at JoVE. And as always, it's my pleasure to welcome you all. First of all, I can see that, as always, there's a lot of you joining, and I'd love to hear from you. I want to see where you're from. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your opinions. This is not, by all means, a one-way conversation. It's supposed to be a space for us to interact, to get to know each other, and also to build a community and to exchange ideas. If it's not your first time here, you will know that this webinar is going to be about 45 minutes in length, at the end of which we will have a short Q&A session, and there will be a chance for you to ask questions, to, again, talk about whatever you feel like is relevant, but also the conversation doesn't need to stop here. There's going to be an opportunity for you to continue to ask questions. I will share a form through which you can be in touch with us and get to understand the topic a little bit more and get to talk to us even further. I am going to do that right now. Oh, hi. So many people joining from different spots. It's wonderful, as always. Let me share this very, very quickly. This is the form that will allow you to get in touch with us in case you have any remaining questions, anything that we're not able to address during the webinar. You can always use this form, fill it up, and we will get a chance to speak with you later as well. A couple more housekeeping items before we begin. Well, as you know, there's a chat box, which you're already using. There's also a Q&A box. Please submit your questions. We will have a chance at the end to actually get to talk to each other and interact. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear about your experiences as well. And if there's anything relevant that you want to share, that's the perfect place to do it. One more thing. I am speaking in English, but a lot of you might be, second language speakers of this particular language. So you don't necessarily need to follow me in English. There is an opportunity here on Zoom to add automated live subtitles. What I'm going to do is I will try to pace myself because I usually speak very, very fast. So in this instance, I will try to slow down a little bit, but if you'd love to get those subtitles in more than 20 languages, they're available in a variety of different options. There is a button just near the Q&A section, and you're going to be able to add the language that you prefer and add the subtitles. So it might make your comprehension easier. Okay, I think we've wrapped up with the majority of the things that I wanted to mention, and now we can dedicate our session to our most important topic, which is UDL, Universal Design for Learning. I decided to go a little bit further with this webinar and discuss the topic from an angle that we usually don't touch upon, which is the variety of learners that enter our classroom, the diversity of the people who enter our classroom, which is why we've chosen as a title, Teaching Every Kind of Learner. So before we dive into the topic, I do want to ask you a question, as always. And the question is, let me just launch it for you all. There we go. The question is very straightforward. Are you familiar with UDL? Have you ever heard of it before? Yes, no, or maybe a little bit. You've heard of it, but you've never had a chance to put it into practice. So I want to hear from you. I want to know what's the general consensus. Also, this will allow me to understand, in which direction we need to go throughout this webinar. Okay. Few more seconds, just making sure everybody gets a chance to respond. But I think we've got pretty good sample already. Okay, I'm going to end it just to show everyone what the results are. And this is quite surprising, quite new compared to our usual webinars. The vast majority of you have actually not heard of UDL, which makes it all the more exciting for me. For those who have, if you're familiar with it, if you've used it, don't worry, I'll try to be practical. I'll try to go into as much detail as I can. I'll try and discuss some things that will be hopefully new to you as well. But for the vast majority of people who actually said no, or maybe yes, I've heard of it, but I've never been able to put it into practice, this is wonderful because I would love to actually start with some basics. What is UDL? The thing that I probably hate the most when I go to conferences, when I attend webinars, is when somebody starts talking about something, especially if it's an acronym, like in this case, and then they just give it for granted. They make it part of our jargon, they make it part of the lingo that they're using, and then it never resumes. And so if you missed that very first bit where they actually defined or tried to give you an understanding of what we're talking about, if you missed that one definition, you are not able to keep up and follow what's been discussed. I'm going to try not to do that here. So let's start with the basics, and then I will try not to give it for granted at any point. So if somebody joins a little bit later, if somebody wants to watch the recording of this webinar, which yes, will be available together with your certificate of participation, you're not lost, right? But let's begin. So UDL, Universal Design for Learning. Now, the best way I think I can describe UDL is with its with its very beginning, universal. So when we think of what our classrooms, the way we build our lessons, the way we build our lectures, UDL is nothing but a framework. It's something that can guide us as educators in creating that learning experience, because learning is a process. It's not just, a moment. So it's an experience that will work not for one person, not for one type of student, but a wide range of students from the very beginning. The concept is different than, starting off a lecture and then trying to adjust. That can happen, of course, but UDL is much more intentional. So instead of stepping into a class and being like, oh, I have a feeling that my students are not really listening to me, or maybe they're not really understanding what's going on, UDL starts at the very beginning of this process and says, okay, I acknowledge that there's going to be a variety of different people in my class. I acknowledge and I know that there's going to be different needs and different abilities and different languages and different situations. How do I address all of these things from the very beginning? And so the idea is to create something that reduces the barriers to learning, that opens up a variety of pathways. And I know that maybe hearing this, you'll think, oh, is going to be very hard, or yes, I know my class is full of people who are very different than each other, but I cannot be a superhero. Trust me, you don't have to be. Well, you can be. Most of you will be because you are educators. So in a way, you are superheroes because you do something really hard. But transmitting your knowledge doesn't have to be difficult just because the people in front of you require some extra care and attention. And that's the point I'm going to try to make. Universal design for learning doesn't have to be complicated. And what we're going to do today through this webinar is understanding the basic principles of it and how to adjust very minimally sometimes or more structurally your lectures, your methods to make it more accessible to everyone. And the best example I have of this is building a city. Now, I was recently in Mexico, and one thing that I noticed is that there is an area of within each bus which is a pink zone, and that's meant for women or women with children. Obviously, it's for safety, but it's also to make them feel more comfortable. And that made me think, it's a very simple thing to do. It's a very simple measure. Obviously, it has to rely on its application, but also it's something that was intentionally designed to make the space feel safer for people. And similarly, I recently went to the movies and I watched Zootropolis 2, which I don't know if it's something that will be on your radar or not, but I remember watching the first movie. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's an incredible animated movie where a variety of different animals live in this sort of utopia. And it's a city where everybody gets to live the way they were born to live. So people, sorry, well, animals in this case, who need to swim, they will have preferential channels to swim through the city. Or animals who are flying will not encounter skyscrapers and windows all the time because it's easy for them to bump into those. So it's a city that's designed for everybody. And that is how I think about UDL. Universal, again, for everyone, design for learning in this case. So it's like designing a city that accommodates everyone. Instead of just having a few steps, it has ramps. Instead of just having one bus for everyone, it has a zone where women can travel by themselves without feeling observed or maybe concerned. And so, in a way, you're not designing something that is of lower quality. You're not lowering your expectations. You're just removing some of the obstacles that wouldn't allow people to meet those expectations. Okay, so you're not lowering them. And I like to think of this city example and the practicality of it because often when people think, oh, I need to design something that is universal and that will accommodate everybody's needs, um, it is quite natural to think, oh, well, I'm going to have to make it simpler. It's not what UDL is about. And the reason why we want to implement it is just, the reality of what we face every day in the class. Our students vary widely in a variety of things. And I'm not just talking about, specific disabilities and so on, or specific needs. I'm talking about prior knowledge. They come and join, and each of them has a different way of thinking about their prior knowledge because they have different ways of having acquired it. So some students will have gone through more strict paths, they will have attended better schools, or maybe they will have great knowledge due to their personal passion for the subject. But there is variety in that prior knowledge that they bring with them. Some students will be foreigners, and so their first language might not be the one in which you're teaching. So language proficiency can also vary. Of course, executive function, these are things that belong to each of us, and also the way we process information. So, not just the way we use information, but the way our brains process it. Some people define themselves as visual learners, right? Some people would never do that. Some people are very attentive to detail, and some people are absolutely not. And one thing I do a lot is I have a little test that I run every time I enter a new class of whether it's students or, adults as well, adult learners. And I try to ask them what kind of learning style they think they have versus what they then end up having or showing when they are faced with a task, with a learning task. And that is surprising every single time because everyone has different ways of processing information. And sometimes we don't stop to think that. Even saying, close your eyes and imagine an apple, if you try to do that in your class, can yield wildly different results. I promise you, some people will see a bright red apple in front of them, and some people will not even be able to imagine what the apple looks like when their eyes are closed. And then some more behavioral aspects, motivation, anxiety, the context in which they live, and of course, the needs that they might have from an accessibility standpoint. So that brings us to the traditional lecture problem. If you've been to one of these webinars before, you know this is something I discuss a lot. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing really wrong with traditional lectures in their purest sense. Of course, we can go through traditional lectures, they can be great, but reiterating the same model over and over and over again every single week for a really long time does not yield the best results. It's great for us to be able to challenge that model a little bit and maybe to vary. Also, because different types of stimuli will yield different types of results. And this is backed by a lot of research. So I call it the traditional lecture problem. Again, don't get me wrong, it is not a problem in itself, but it is a difficulty, an obstacle in itself, trying to approach a traditional lecture. And I'm speaking from a perspective of a person who does really well with traditional lectures, but I'm aware that not everybody's the same. And that's the point of UDL, universal, right? Well, first of all, the problem is that attention, and that's for everyone, decreases after 10 to 15 minutes. So during this webinar, what I'm going to try to do is I will try to break it down. If I was to sit here and speak for like 15 minutes straight, I promise you your attention at one point would absolutely drop. There's a very famous paper written by Bradbury, and by the way, at the end of these slides, as always, you'll have the bibliography, all of the resources, so you can consult and see, the research I've done to put it together, and these people have published. But our attention does drop after 10 to 15 minutes. So if I was to speak for 15 minutes, I would lose you. So in about 10 minutes, I'm going to do something, maybe give you a different poll, maybe, try to ask you a question, maybe try to change things in a way that makes sure we're not going through a traditional sort of lecture here. The second problem is that a passive lecture does reduce performance. So when we compare different models, and multimodal in this case just means trying different things and trying to make lectures different than, one another. When you compare those two, a multimodal type of lecture and a classic traditional type of lecture, the performance afterwards is reduced in the second case. Okay, so again, just giving you some data. You can decide what to do with it, but in my opinion, I think it's great to try to make learning a little bit more interactive in that sense. And finally, our working memory, the one that is able to capture the information and process it quickly, the moment we receive it, has some limitations. And when we receive instruction in a very, very straightforward way, with the same tone, with the same type of information that goes through the same channel, this model may make it a little bit too dense for our working memory. Imagine if I wanted to explain to you how to bake a cake, and I sat here and I explained the process bit by bit, very thoroughly. What are the chances of you listening to that and then going and proceeding to go and bake that cake? Very slim. But what if I showed you? What if I asked you questions? What if we broke it down? What if we changed the way we deliver this information? Chances are your ability to use your working memory and apply that later would increase. So we know why, but who came up with it? That's a question I get asked a lot when we discuss these theories and when, the pedagogy aspect kicks in. Well, the idea behind UDL is that when we analyze our brain, so it comes from cognitive neuroscience, as many of the other pedagogical theories that we discuss. But when we think of our brain and the different parts it's composed of, there are three essential networks that are involved in the learning process. This is from the CAS proceedings. It's a very interesting conference that happens every year. And in 2018, they came up with this framework that places the different networks that have been involved in the learning process. So what are these networks? The so-called affective networks, these are the ones that trigger our motivation, our interest, our persistence. It's basically whatever makes us willing to do something. It's like when we try a new sport and we're like, oh wow, I'm really motivated to do well. I'm a rookie, I've just begun, but for some reason I have an interest. My persistence kicks in, my desire for persistence kicks in. Then we have recognition networks, and those are related to how we comprehend, how we perceive the information. So the initial, let's say, motivation, then the ability to actually process the information, and finally, the strategic networks. Those are the ones related to whatever happens after we have received the information, understood the information, and then we act on it, right? We try to bake the cake. And so that's related to planning, action, our problem solving. Again, going back to my cake example, the first one is, oh, I really want to bake a cake because I've always wanted to be proficient at that, or maybe I'd love to eat it afterwards. Then my perception of the information, and then my action, the one that I take when I actually want to replicate what I have perceived as information. And how does UDL approach that? Well, UDL, again, Universal Design for Learning, tries to act on each of these types of networks to try to maximize the learning experience. So when it comes to the affective networks, so my motivation, there's multiple ways we can engage people and motivate them to do well, to perform an action, to affect their persistence. So UDL will try to tackle this by giving us many ways to engage. Recognition networks are the ones related to how we perceive the information. So universal design for that will be, why don't we find different ways to represent the information? Because again, somebody will hear the information, somebody will need to see it, somebody will need to actually bake, use their hands to replicate what they're seeing. So why don't we design this to happen in multiple ways? And finally, the strategic networks, the ones that give us the output, right? And UDL, designing universally, will be about creating many ways and many channels through which we can express that learning, the output. So, very simply said, many ways to capture the attention, many ways to deliver the information, many ways for the output to be created. Some people will be great at tests. Some people will do very well in public speaking. Other people will write great essays without the use of ChatGPT. Um, Multiple ways, also for the output. Which brings us to the three principles. How do we make it happen? That's the question, right? How do we apply these principles to what we do every day in class? Well, first of all, the multiple means of engagement. So, how do I get to have a way to attract students, to make them engaged, and to make sure that all of them stay engaged? Some of them will need, some sensory information. Some of them will need some pressure, knowing that there's a test coming up might make them engage. But also, there's other things that we can do. For example, having some polls. The ones that I've given you, the one that I've given you at the very beginning was a way to engage with you, to, make you be on your laptop for a few minutes and say, okay, actually, there's a question popping up. Why don't I try to answer that, right? But that can also be scenario questions. It can be short quizzes. It can be pretty much anything that has a two-way relation, that creates a two-way relationship with the people who are listening to you. But also, we can offer different choices in the assignment format. This is going to be more related to the output, I'm aware, but also mentioning it at the beginning, saying, you're going to be able to submit a presentation that can be either a video presentation, or you can deliver it in person, or you can write it. That can create more engagement because people will feel like they will project themselves, right? They will start to think, oh, wow, if I persist, I will then get to express myself in the best possible way for me. So that's a new way to create engagement. And finally, real world relevance, using examples that are relatable, using situations and scenarios that can be adapted to everybody's lives. I'm doing it with you. I talked about a trip that I took to another continent. I talked about a movie that I watched, and maybe some of you did with your children or by yourselves. But I'm also trying to make it relevant to your class, to what you experience. And similarly, trying to do the same with your students can be a good way to engage with them, to create that sort of connection. And then we have multiple means of representation. So many ways to ensure that the information gets perceived. So we managed to engage people, we managed to make them willing to learn. How do we make sure that they actually get to understand the information? Well, my recommendation is, first of all, don't stop at the very beginning of the process. Right now, I've put together slides, but there will be a video. There will be there will be a few images alongside the text, but there can be much more. There can be, for example, a pre-teaching vocabulary. This is, again, one of many suggestions, but I've used it in the past quite successfully, and giving my students kind of like a series of words that we're going to use ahead of the lecture and letting them know what they're going to be kind of creates that sort of ability to project themselves into the lecture and what's going to happen. So I have my vocabulary with all of the different things that are there, and this can help them follow. What I mentioned at the beginning, I hate it when I go to a conference and the presentation begins. I miss the first 2 minutes where they define the concept, and then I lose the entirety of it because I'm not keeping up. Pre-teaching vocabulary can be wonderful because people, if they're not listening 100% of their time, cognition drops and they're not paying attention, they can always go back and say, oh, what was that acronym? Here we go. And then they go back. But also chunking processes into steps, right? So instead of explaining everything in one go, using the so-called micro learning. So small modules for learning that allow people to understand concepts, wrap them up in their brains, and then move on. Again, I'm going to try to do that with you. So at the end of this, tell me if I was successful. This is also kind of a meta webinar in that sense. We're trying some of these principles as I explained them. Might be difficult, but you'll tell me. And finally, multiple means of expression, of action. How do we make sure that the information that's been perceived then gets its own output? So, how do we enable students to express themselves and the information they have perceived in a way that doesn't penalize anyone? If somebody is not really good at public speaking, I understand that we have to put them in a situation when there's a bit of a challenge. But if we only do public speaking with people who are far away from that, that's going to penalize them. And similarly, we're not used to thinking about it with tests because we just give for granted that people, everybody can do well on a test, but we'd never think about that if we were to say public speaking, right? We'd say, no, actually, a lot of people are not great at public speaking. It's the same. A lot of people might not be great at tests. A lot of people might have issues with the way they are constructed and they might not give their best. Having multiple ways to express the content, to give an output, increases our chances that all types of learners are going to be able to engage with our content, perceive the information, and give us an output at the end. So don't stop. Written, video, oral assessments, have a bunch. You don't want to penalize anyone? Have a bit of everything. I know it can be time consuming sometimes, but one of my favorite modules at university, philosophy of science. I remember its assignment because the professor came and said, "I just want you to have a way to express your opinion on what would two philosophers say if they were to meet in the same room." And the output was so different. So my colleague and I who were working on this project, we made a video out of it, which was actually a rap battle, and it turned out to be really interesting. But we made a video out of it. Somebody else had a poem written. Somebody else wrote a classic essay. Someone else performed in front of everybody. They were really good. They were in like drama club, and they performed in front of everybody. This kind of discussion between the two philosophers. And it was wonderful. The variety, the multimodal expression. Again, it cannot happen all the time. For some situations, it'll be easier than others. But I promise you, even a chemistry assignment can be given in more than one way. And then, of course, having checkpoints, rubrics, there's a variety of ways. We'll get to that. But I just wanted to outline these three principles, the fact that there are many ways to engage. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on two. I want you to leave the session with, yes, some theory, some understanding of what this is, but I would never want you to then sit down and think, okay, how do I do any of that? I don't want you to leave having to use too much of your brain power to even conceive what you could be doing to implement this. So I'd love to focus on two examples right now, which hopefully will trigger some novelty in your lectures. So let's see how you make it happen. One example is videos. Videos are great for a variety of reasons. They're intuitive, they are easy to understand, they are usually quite short, and they have a variety of features that correspond to what we would call a universal design. Let me start from the very basic one. Subtitles. Again, I'm speaking to you and I mentioned the subtitle function. This is to increase the accessibility, but subtitles are sometimes not sufficient. Sometimes we need an audio to be in multiple languages. And now, thanks to AI, we've progressed enormously in this direction. The fact that a video can be listened to in a different language or can have the main language spoken and then subtitles below, it increases proficiency by a lot. So accessibility wise, it's wonderful to have those features and videos provide them in real time. Then one that a lot of people don't think about, which is playback speed. Now, again, it might be given for granted that everybody understands what you're saying and they don't have to re-listen to it. And that's probably true. But again, at the beginning of the session, I said, I'll try and pace myself. I'll try and speak a bit more slowly than I usually do. That's something that you wouldn't have to think about through a video. A video can be watched at twice the speed or half the speed. And that's up to the person who's watching it. There's no shame. There's no one looking. They can do it in their own time. If they have to go slow, to note down all of the steps, or if they want to go fast because they know what we're talking about and they just want to have a quick mental recap, they can do that. Again, the video is short. That's not an accessibility function in itself, but when we think of universal design, we want to go towards that micro packaging of information to avoid the overload. The fact that the video is short makes for a great tool. And finally, what is intuitively the most important feature when we think about designing for everyone is the accessible audio description. I'm going to use this example later, but we have a wonderful case study that I have been mentioning in a few sessions, and I finally get to present to you today, of how much of an audio description can make a difference in class. Audio description is nothing but those subtitles that we usually, have enhanced. So it describes what's happening. In this case, it wouldn't just say tissues are groups of structurally similar cells. It would say, in the video, we saw a woman facing the camera and wearing a top and some shorts. In this image, we notice that the tissues are groups of structurally similar cells, and that's related to. So it explains what usually a person who can see would be able to see. And the second example I have is quizzes. Quizzes are slightly less intuitive in this universal design structure, but why are they useful for everyone? Well, again, we can have them in multiple languages, and that's great because of what we mentioned earlier, the fact that not everybody speaks English as a first language, or the fact that people might need, to learn new words in a different language, for instance. So that availability is great. Another thing that's wonderful about quizzes is the fact that they do something which is called activation of background knowledge. So when you enter a new learning environment and you say, okay, I want to engage everyone, remember that engagement that we discussed, like how do I make sure people retain those networks and so on? One great way to do it is to actually start off with a quick question to ask, how much do you know about this topic that we're going to discuss? And this way, which is what I did with you at the beginning, this way you can adjust as a lecturer and you can decide how much you need to go in, like how much depth you need to go to be able to explain that concept. Maybe everybody will already be very proficient because again, prior knowledge is something that we don't really necessarily know much about. Or maybe your students will need to go through the basics. So great for activating that background knowledge. The brain starts working. You as an educator get immediate feedback and you can design the lecture for everyone at that point. Also, warm-up questions, they're great. Again, we start activating the brain, we start them thinking. There's a higher chance that their different types of networks will be activated throughout the learning process. And finally, quizzes are wonderful when it comes to designing for everyone, not just, one type of learner, because of the so-called vocabulary scaffolds. Now, vocabulary scaffolds are something, it's a fancy word to say new words that we need to learn to be able to progress in our learning journey. And that's something that prevents a lot of people from doing so. The fact that they stop understanding because some words are not familiar to them anymore, then creates for an issue throughout. But if we cement that knowledge of new words, of new vocabulary through these quizzes, through some warm-up questions, that can be a great way to make sure that we're leveling the playing field from the very beginning. Again, two options that I'm familiar with because of the nature of my job, but I wanted to give them to you as an example of how you can make it accessible for everyone without having to reinvent the wheel. Videos are a great way because of the variety of functions. Quizzes are a great way because they activate several networks within our brains and they create for a better setup for everybody. Which brings me to the case study. I personally think this is one of the highlights of my job. So it's great for me to present these sort of things. But a few years back, a professor from the University of Milan came and she was teaching a chemistry degree, undergraduate level, and said, I have an issue. I have a student who's visually impaired. blind. And I don't know how to make the classroom setup fair for everyone. So it wasn't just about the student, it was about everyone. And that's a definition of universal design. You're not just designing for one person, you're not designing for one group, you're designing for everybody. Now, why is that challenging? Because chemistry heavily depends on visualization, diagrams, 3D, spatial animations, and the lot. Molecular animations, they're very, very important when it comes to chemistry, and lab demonstrations. So if you want to get an undergraduate degree in chemistry, you're going to have to visualize concepts, understand animations and molecules, and do labs. And somebody who wants to pursue a chemistry degree with an issue of this kind, how do you make it happen? Now, it has to be fair for everyone. It has to be universal. I'm bringing this as a case study. Obviously, this is the most extreme version, but trust me, in your class right now, there is a student who is struggling, and maybe it's not as evident, but they would benefit from an approach that is similar when we think of creating a space for everyone. So, what did we do? We gave this student videos, which is very counterintuitive because when you tell a blind person, I'm going to give you a video to learn, that might seem provocative to say the least. But it wasn't, because the videos had audio description, the one that we mentioned earlier. And the audio description allowed the student to properly visualize what was happening in their mind. And that's very different than just having, textbooks read out loud, because the vast majority of content is not created with accessibility standards in mind. If something instead is created as an audio description with that purpose, it will be meant for people who, in that moment, cannot watch. And obviously, a visually impaired person is a clear example, but also you might not be able to watch because you're taking notes, or maybe because in that moment it's just not a possibility. Maybe there is technology limitations. There is a variety of things. So audio description can be wonderful in that sense for a variety of cases, this one in particular. And then we had animations. And again, this might seem very simple and a little bit counterintuitive, but the fact that the concepts were broken down into small chunks made it much easier to digest. Because the information of a lecture that goes on for an hour will be more difficult to digest compared to alone without any other stimuli, compared to having that plus a series of small videos, animations, things that show discrete steps, narrated visuals, descriptions of what's happening in the space, right? It's very different to hear the molecule has 3 atoms, or the molecule is composed of 3 atoms in the shape of a triangle. This triangle is equilateral, and each of the atoms is equally distant from the nucleus as do. Very different, and it creates for that visual mind. And of course, it helps you build cause and effect sequences because you're breaking down the information in small chunks. You have more time to retain that information. And trust me, this was not just useful for that one student. And finally, the trickiest bit, lab. How does a visually impaired person go to the lab? Well, if you are able to hear lab tutorials that describe in the finest detail possible what's going to happen, you're then able to build a mental model. And again, this is not just for the visually impaired. You're able to build a mental model of what you're going to do. A lot of piano players are able to rehearse an entire concert by closing their eyes and pretending to be playing because it's a mental sequence that they have. And similarly, ballerinas, they don't need to actually perform to be able to remember the steps. They have to have a visual sequence in mind. And so they can rehearse cognitively as many times as they can. And once they arrive, once they have to perform, once they have to play the piano, once they have to do a chemistry lab, they can do so confidently and prepared. The outcome, I'm bringing it to you because we're very proud of that. But the outcome was that the student achieved better understanding, for sure, of the different concepts. They arrived in class much more prepared because they watched some videos, watched, obviously, played in this sense. And they had a conceptual understanding of what was going to be explained even before going to class. The lab performance was really, really strong. And the fact that this student had tactile sensitivity, which is often heightened in people with visual issues, that made for a wonderful contribution within the lab. And also a deeper sense of inclusion, the fact that you're not excluding anyone from this class, but you're not creating something that's just for one person, you're creating something for the classroom. It was advantages for everybody. And this student in particular graduated top of the class and actually helped others perform well in the labs because, again, of that heightened tactile sensitivity. But again, it was something that everybody loved. The fact that there were videos, pre-class material, that you could mentally rehearse what you were going to do in the lab. It was beneficial for everyone. And so this way of achieving universal design wasn't lowering the standards. It was actually making sure that everybody would get the same opportunities. And maybe those who were not so evidently in need also benefited from this approach. But now I've spoken for too long. Your cognitive overload is kicking in, so I actually want to hear from you. So I am going to launch a new poll, which is, what is your main concern when approaching UDL? We've spoken about this universal design for learning, and we have a few options. The first one is students won't use the material that I have provided. Second one is it could lower the academic standards for everybody. And the third one is I don't know where to start or I don't have enough time. I'm giving you a few seconds to reply so everybody gets a chance. Okay, just a few more seconds. I can see people are being very active, which is good. It tells me that you're still with me. Okay, I feel like we're at a good point. Why don't I show you the results of what we have? Okay, I'm glad to see not too many of you mentioned the second one because I've made a whole argument about the fact that you wouldn't be lowering your standards, but we'll talk about it again. The vast majority of you actually said, I don't know where to start. I don't have enough time. And somebody said, I'm scared that if I start using the material, I will have done a whole bunch of work, but my students will not actually use this. So I did want to hear from you, and I have heard you. So why don't we look at each one of these? Again, I'm not trying to convince you to, do otherwise. I'm just trying to give you a different perspective. I've tried to put this up because I wanted to see what your perception of this is. Here's some potential advice. So students won't use the optional materials. It will be true in some cases. It's not, it's not one size fits all. Not everybody will start putting a material and have an immediate action from their student, immediate positive feedback. My suggestion in this case is to integrate these things into something that is perceived of value. So exam season at some point will come up. The fact that you maybe put some quizzes on the platform on your LMS is valuable to students, right? So if we were to put in something that for them is important, some prep tasks, some quizzes, some questions, some videos. We saw two examples like videos and quizzes. Within something that they think is valuable, the chances of them using that material are definitely going to be higher. Again, it depends on the nature of what you're teaching, but usually just saying, okay, before class, to make sure that everybody, no matter what their background, has two or three key concepts in mind, that vocabulary building. Here's a couple of videos that explain that. I mean, you don't necessarily need to have the whole class watch those videos, but those who perceive the importance of having the vocabulary in place, they will definitely use it. And another thing that I want to mention, which might not be too reassuring, but UDL is not necessarily about making sure that everybody uses what you're suggesting. It's about making sure that if they have difficulties and if they want to improve, they get a chance to. And so I wouldn't be too concerned about this, meaning I wouldn't put too much attention towards how many individuals use the material, but I would put a lot of attention towards what the value of one person using that material is. And if that one person, that one view of one video actually has a great impact on a person's motivation, desire to graduate, appreciation for the subject, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth adding something to a lecture, to a course, to anything, even if it makes a small difference in terms of numbers, which can be very, very large for individuals. That blind student example that we use a lot, like I've spoken about a few times, it's very striking to me because when I think about it, it's yes, one person, but really it was much more than just one person. The second one we mentioned, but in case you're not convinced just yet, you can still keep very strict assessment criteria. And I promise you, making the assessment strict doesn't mean that you don't need to make it multimodal. You can be very, very strict when marking those assessments in video format, written format, spoken format. If you keep the criteria strict and easy to understand, especially for your students, UDL will not lower the rigor of what you are proposing. And finally, the vast majority of you actually said, I don't know where to begin. I've given you two examples, videos and quizzes, and most of those are available on the internet, on JoVE, on many platforms. And so my encouragement here is to actually try to just use one video, one captioned video again or explanation, maybe try to activate the AD function to hear what the description, audio description sounds like, just to try it. Or maybe just add a diagram. Sometimes all your students will need is a visualization of what's happening, and that can already make a difference for a lot of different learners. And again, this is what I'm familiar with, so is what I can suggest to you is a video that is 1 or 2 minutes that is potentially a live action demonstration. Animations are usually easier to understand because they're meant for pedagogical uptake. Of course, with captions, that's super important. I really, really recommend activating the captions no matter what. Even if people mostly speak the language that's, spoken in class, captions can make a difference, especially because in many of the STEM subjects we teach, a lot of the words will be new. And even if you are a mother tongue speaker of the language, you might not have heard of that word before. Seeing how it's written can be positive for anyone. So I generally recommend it. Of course, the audio description that we mentioned, but also other things. For instance, the fact that there are real scientists in these videos. Yes, some of them are animations, but others are scientists in the lab actually performing the experiments. That makes for higher relatability and ability to understand. And of course, the students can do a lot of things. They can rewatch, they can annotate, they can create their own summaries. This way, the whole package makes the video a very, very well aligned element in your course design. So if you want to design for everybody universally, I highly recommend videos, and I've put here an example. And with that, we will move on to questions, and thank you for staying with me until the end. I can see that there's already a lot of them. Meanwhile, while I go on to questions, I just wanted to take a second to show you the link that I've given to you. We only have about 10 minutes, so I will take a few questions, but I know many of you will have many more. So again, I'm going to share this link in our chat, so you get an option to actually get in touch with us in case you want a deeper understanding, you want to ask more questions in case you actually want to have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation. I do want to remind you, getting in touch with us is free. Nobody will charge you anything for having a conversation about these themes, okay? You have a person who speaks your language, who's able to interact with you to, give you some more updates, ideas, and you can also update your course, upload your course syllabus. So if you want to receive specific suggestions of how to implement UDL in your course, you can do so by using this form. Now, let me put up the bibliography, which I think some of you might be interested in. And in the meantime, I'm going to go on to questions. Let me open Oh, wow, there's so many. Okay, um, so somebody is mentioning in university and master programs, we are forced to give lectures that are longer than 15 minutes, like 3 hours. What do we do with the issue of attention in this? For that one, I would specifically recommend watching one of our previous webinars about the so-called microlearning. Microlearning addresses exactly that problem by showing that there's ways to package the lessons. And it's not about taking a break. It's not about saying, okay, we've done, 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, now let's take a break. It can be about taking a break, but it's about taking a cognitive break. Cognitive breaks can be, I'm going to put it very simply, um, here's a concept. I'm going to explain it to you. Then I'm going to play a 2-minute video about this concept. And then I'm going to pop a question on the screen that you can get a QR code and, answer through your phone. And we're going to see how well you do on it. The fact that you are then stopping the classic flow of words, words, words with actions, that is already a way to reduce the cognitive overload. Because despite the fact that you're now asking them to do something active, so actually, perform, right, instead of just listening, that actually breaks down the process and makes sure that the attention can resume fresh. I know, again, it might sound counterintuitive, but the moment people have tried it, the feedback has been wonderful. So I highly encourage you to do that, to just maybe try this packaging of information and making sure that there is a way to break it down. Either a question, either a video, either a short break. Sometimes a break is absolutely needed. Or it can be, having them interact. Why don't you then discuss? Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, discuss in pairs, and then somebody will raise their hand and tell me the answer to this. It can be very simple, but it is extremely effective, and I highly encourage it. And thank you for the question. Oh, a very interesting question. Do students need certain preparation before applying UDL? Okay, short answer is not a lot, but I think it's very important when talking to our students. It's important to let them know that we are working towards their success. So when we're, spending time and energy trying to implement something that works for everyone, I think it's wonderful to let them know that we're doing it. It's not preparation that's necessary, but it's awareness in this case. It's saying, I'm not putting the videos out up there on Moodle, on Canvas or whatever because, I enjoy it. I'm doing it because of this and this and this. I'm doing it because I'm trying to be more intentional and conscious that each of you will be different, that each of you will learn differently, that each of you will require different types of things. Being vocal about these things usually really pays off. First of all, because it shows emotional intelligence, and Gen Z students tend to really love that. And they tend to appreciate the attention and the care. But also, it will make people feel heard and it will make them use the content more. It will make them certainly more grateful for the attention that's being put towards that. And one thing that I've seen is that if we are explaining to students and to the class, I'm talking about the case study that we mentioned, for example, with the blind student, what a lot of people tend to do is they then commit to it, but then they come to you with further requests. So it becomes a two-way process. They're like, oh, thank you for putting the video. I still didn't understand. Can I get some questions? Can I get some study material? Can I get a reading? And so I would recommend doing it, although it's not necessary. Um, there's time for one more question. Let's see, we've got so many. Oh my goodness, there's so many great questions. What if you have, somebody's asking, what if you have 250 students? How can I increase students' involvement in my lessons, which are concentrated in 2 months and the syllabus is very long and complex? This is a great question. And my recommendation, well, obviously, each of these will need a little bit more of an in-depth conversation, which again is why I encourage you to use the form in case you want to continue that conversation. Um, my recommendation in this case is to use the outside of class time as much as possible. So those examples that I mentioned, giving students very, very short, but very effective contents to use and consume before the lecture can be helpful. Not everybody will watch those 2, 3 minute videos, but I promise if you put two or three up with the basic definitions of what they absolutely need to know before entering the class, it will help. That's one way. It's the classic flip learning approach. We also have a webinar in our repository around that. But yeah, that's usually very effective. I know complex syllabi are definitely a pain point, but there's many ways to tackle it, even simple ones. And it can be challenging, I know, but we're here to help. So if you want to have a more in-depth conversation again, very, very happy to continue it, very happy to um, share more suggestions. I'm sorry to be a bit generic right now. I'm just a bit conscious of time, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming, your comments, your kindness. You're always such a wonderful crowd. I wanted to mention that all who came are going to receive a certificate of participation as always. Just going to go back to the thank you slide because that's what I'm trying to express. This was the last webinar for this year. We're wrapping up 2025 with this session, but we have so many more planned for next year. And I'm really excited. I've just been to a very insightful conference where I got much more in terms of new pedagogical topics and aspects that we can touch upon, more opportunities for us to discuss, to get together. Again, thank you very much for coming. It's always a pleasure to see you here, and I hope to see you again in 2026. Just as a piece of news, more than 10,000 people showed up to our webinars in 2025. I couldn't be happier and I couldn't be more proud. Again, thanks everyone, and hopefully see you very soon. Bye.